Roman army. The Romans arrived in Britain around AD 43, and their conquest was complete by around AD 87, and their conquest had a lasting effect on Britain, which is still visible to this day. However, they not only left ruins behind, where over the centuries there have been many people who've claimed to have encountered Roman soldiers when they were caught up in some kind of time slip. The following two stories are about people who came upon Roman soldiers in modern-day Britain. The first incident happened in the 1960s, when a Mrs. Rawlings from the North London borough of Barnet was visiting a Roman Verulamium in St Albans, north of London. Verulamium was a town in Roman Britain and was situated southwest of the modern city of St Albans in Hertfordshire in southern England. At the time of the incident, Mrs. Rawlings was visiting the Roman ruins that were displayed at the Verulamium Arena, which was part of a major local exhibition. All of a sudden, she noticed a procession of Roman soldiers entering the arena, and they were marching in rank and file, where the standard bearers were carrying what appeared to be the unit insignia, which were carved eagles. Following behind them was a man dressed in white and was wearing a laurel crown. Roman emperors such as Julius Caesar wore laurel crowns to show importance and godly status, and in ancient Rome it was worn on the head as a symbol of triumph. So the man wearing the laurel crown was obviously a high-ranking official, and could have been one of the emperors that occasionally visited the area. Then the important official moved to a chair in the centre of the platform area, where two standard bearers positioned themselves either side of him. The whole event was happening as Mrs. Rawlings looked on in total astonishment. Then all of a sudden, the whole scene disappeared in front of her eyes, and she was left looking at the modern-day ruins of the Verulamium. Mrs. Rawlings was not the first person to experience a time slip where Roman soldiers appeared, and many people have attested to seeing them all over Britain. On Wednesday, March the 16th, 1988, in West Kirby in northwest England, Brian Hollands, 21, and his girlfriend, Tina Taylor, 18, had been out one night at the local pub called the D Hotel. They both left the hotel at around 10:15 p.m. and walked down the side of the building. It was a clear and still night when Tina commented on faint luminous mist coming up from the ground, and as Brian was observing the mist, Tina yelled out as the wall of the hotel that she'd been leaning against suddenly vanished, and she found herself falling backwards into empty space. As Brian and Tina looked around, they found that the D Hotel had completely disappeared, along with every other building and structure in the vicinity, and they were now standing in tall grass and trees as far as they could see. There was a full moon, as Brian and Tina were now in total shock, trying to come to terms with what had just happened to them. They bravely ventured forward, where what was once a paved road was now just rocks and long grass. As they made their way westwards, they came upon some marshland where D Lane once stood, and other landmarks had now disappeared, such as the marine lake, and they both looked at each other in a dazed state, wondering what the hell had happened and how did they end up in the middle of nowhere, and came to the conclusion that they were now lost. Tina then spotted three figures in the distance on horseback coming towards them, but Brian had a bad feeling as they drew closer. Tina figured the men on horseback might be able to give them directions, but Brian quickly suggested they crouch and hide in the long grass, hoping they would not be spotted with the full moon. As the three men came closer, they noticed that the full moon was reflecting off of what appeared to be armour, and as they drew even closer, they looked like Roman soldiers, which scared the hell out of them. After seeing the soldiers close up, both Tina and Brian figured they'd somehow been transported back in time, and when the Roman soldiers disappeared into the distance, they felt safe to come out of hiding and walk back to the area they'd just come from. Then all of a sudden, the moon disappeared behind some clouds, and they were back amongst familiar buildings on Meals Drive in West Kirby. It was at this stage that Tina allowed herself to cry, as she feared she would never see her family again. When they tried to tell their terrifying experience to friends and family, they were met with laughter and derision. It appears that Tina and Brian had been caught in a time slip and had momentarily been transported back almost 2,000 years. After researching local history, they found that the Romans would have occupied the area around AD 50. Leeds Castle. Alice Pollock was a psychometrist and is also called an object reader, which is a process where facts or impressions about a person or thing are received through contact with an object associated with the subject of the impressions. One day, Alice was visiting Leeds Castle in Kent in southeast England and entered a room that was known as Henry VIII's room. She walked around touching various ancient objects in the hope of experiencing events from another period in time. Alice had easy access to most rooms as she was a relative of the family that resided at Leeds Castle, and the relative specifically chose a room that Alice Pollock's parents had once stayed in. Alice then proceeded to walk around the room, touching various objects where she initially received no impressions. Then all of a sudden, the room completely changed, and instead of its modern comfortable appearance, became cold and bare, without any carpets. Logs were now burning in the fireplace, which was now in another part of the room. And in front of Alice stood a woman, wearing a white dress, and was deep in concentration, and appeared to be anguished whilst walking up and down. The room had been the prison of Queen Joan of Navarre, who was Henry V's stepmother, who had been accused of witchcraft by her husband. The charges were probably an attempt at claiming her wealth, as Joan had never been involved in any witchcraft. She had been imprisoned in Leeds Castle, where she maintained a luxurious lifestyle. When Henry V lay dying in 1422, he ordered that she be released and have her goods returned to her, where Joan resumed her life as a wealthy widow. Although Alice Pollock appears to have been momentarily transported back in time, it is also possible that she'd experienced a residual haunting, where apparitions are seen walking around a room doing the same motion over and over, and are unaware of the people around them. These apparitions do not have any interaction with witnesses. Another name for residual hauntings is the stone tape theory, where ghosts and hauntings are like tape recordings that leave mental impressions during an emotional or traumatic event. These in turn are recorded into walls or rocks and replayed under certain conditions. Alice had seen Queen Joan in a state of extreme stress and anxiety, thereby leaving behind an emotional recording. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. A time slip is a phenomenon that causes unexplained and unexpected time travel. There are many reputable people who claim to have encountered a time slip, and the following story is about two Englishmen in the early 50s who encountered something once in Greece that haunted them for the rest of their life because they had no explanation for what they'd experienced. The following time slip event took place on March the 15th and 16th in 1954 in Greece, where two young men by the name of Colin Sandhurst and Reginald Renwick were on holiday. One day, Colin had a strong urge to visit the famous historic site of Olympia. Initially, Reginald was not as keen as Colin to visit the historic location, but had nevertheless agreed to accompany him. The following day, they boarded the train to Olympia, which in the early 50s was just a small village. After arriving in Olympia, they then booked into a hotel that was as small like a cottage, and after a few days, asked the owner of the hotel where they should visit, and he suggested they go up into the mountains, where they would get an excellent view of the picturesque valley below. He said that it was not a difficult climb, and if it was a clear day, they would get a beautiful view of the ocean. They took the hotelier's advice, and the following day headed for the hills. And when they arrived at the summit, they found there were no boulders, rocks, trees, or houses. Instead, there was flat grassland as far as they could see. After admiring the scenery, they then headed to the opposite side of the mountain, which was totally different, as they came upon old rusty farm machinery and an old cattle shed, but there was nobody present. They continued their walk, and after a few meters came to the edge of a mountain which was extremely steep and overlooked a valley far below. Initially, they could not get a clear view of the valley, as it was surrounded by mist that appeared to cover the valley like a white cloth. Then all of a sudden the mist parted in a straight line, and it was as if somebody had cut it with a knife. The clouds then parted, where one side went to the left and the other went to the right, But what baffled them was that there was no wind or even a breeze that could have caused the clouds to part in that strange way. The valley below was now crystal clear, and from their high vantage point gave them an amazing view. They observed a building made of wood that stood in the centre of a large circle of either light sand or soil. Both Colin and Reginald could hear the sound of children singing, what they appeared to be chanting, and thought maybe could have been coming from the wooden building, as it looked like a school or church. They continued to look down on the valley, and on the outside of the large sandy area they could see houses, and next to the houses were rows of huts with flat-top roofs. Between each row of huts were roads. Several of the huts must have had fires burning, as smoke was coming up in a perfect spiral, as there was no wind to blow the smoke away. However, after viewing this idyllic scenery for a few minutes, they thought it strange that everything was perfectly still, and there was nobody walking around. There was no movement whatsoever, which was even stranger because on checking their watches, it was 10 a.m. in the morning, and people and animals should have been out and about. For some unknown reason, Colin quickly turned his head around, followed by Reginald, and standing behind them was a young man on a horse who was very close to them. The young man looked about 20, and he was dressed in a long-sleeved white shirt with a dark waistcoat, and on his head was a large wide-brimmed hat that appeared to be made of leather. The young man then lifted his head to his mouth and appeared to have a cigarette between his fingers. The young man spoke very softly, but they could not understand him, as he was obviously speaking in his native tongue. Colin then looked across to Reginald, who said, "I think he wants us to light his cigarette. Throw me your matches." Colin then studied the young man's horse, or what he believed was a pony, as it was small. The pony was light grey with brown patches with a ruck on its back. What was confusing Colin was that the horse was extremely close, yet he could not smell anything. It gave off no animal odour. Colin then looked back at the young man, whose hand was no longer near his face, and on closer observation he could see it was not a cigarette in his hand but a piece of brown paper that looked to be the size of a cigarette. What was also troubling Colin was how come when the young man and his pony came so close did they not hear him approaching, and they did not make a sound. They appeared to come out of nowhere. At this stage Colin was feeling a bit concerned, and something was telling him that they should move away, and he said to Reginald they should head back to the hotel. They slowly backed away, leaving the young man and his horse behind, and after they had moved about 20 metres, Colin looked back to see if the young man was still there, but to his utter amazement, found the young man and his horse were no longer there. They'd completely vanished. He looked around and saw that the land around where the young man had just been standing was flat and open grassland, so there was nowhere for him to have disappeared in such a short time, and he also looked around the old shed, but he was nowhere to be seen. Reginald suggested that they must have gone down the mountainside, but they realised, well, that was impossible because no man or horse could have survived going down such a steep gradient. When they arrived back at the hotel, they approached the owner and asked him the name of the village they'd just observed from the mountain. The owner looked at them confused and said there was no such village in the valley. Reginald did not seem convinced by the owner's response, and the following day he left the hotel at 9:30 a.m. and did not return until 4:30 p.m. He told Colin that he'd walked back up to the mountain to the exact spot where they'd been the day before. To his astonishment, he said there were no longer any houses, mud huts, roads, schools, or churches at all. Everything they'd observed the day before had completely vanished. Today, both men are in their 80s, and Colin felt he needed to go back to the mountain to see for himself, but Reginald convinced him that there was nothing to be seen. The only explanation Colin had was that both he and Reginald had encountered a time slip whilst they were on the mountain in Olympia. How else could those wooden structures and mud-built dwellings that appeared to them from a different period of time just disappear? Another major factor for people who encounter time slips is that they always comment on the silence that surrounds them, and on many occasions there are never any people, just buildings. The sight of the young man and his horse adds extra mystery to this strange event, and what would have happened if they had attempted to shake hands with the young man or pat the horse, and what was on the piece of paper that had held up to his face, and when he spoke, what was he actually saying to them? The Edwardian shopkeeper. The following timeslip story took place in 1973 in Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, which is a resort town on the east coast of England. A man with the amusing surname Mr. Squirrel entered an old-fashioned shop surrounded by cobblestones in the main street of Great Yarmouth with the intention of purchasing some transparent envelopes in which he could put his coins. As he entered the premises, he noticed that the inside was also old-fashioned, but the strange thing of all was that once inside the shop, he felt an eerie silence and the outside traffic noise had completely vanished. As he approached the counter, a young woman suddenly appeared. He noticed that she was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a blouse and a cameo brooch around her neck. Her skirt was long, and as she approached him, her skirt made a swishing noise on the floor, and her hair had been pulled back into a bun. At first, he was taken aback by what she was wearing, but he realised that was the 1970s, where her attire would not have been out of place. He then asked the young lady whether she had any envelopes suitable for his coins, whereas she produced a type of envelope that she said was used by fishermen to keep their hooks in. He purchased 36 envelopes for 1 shilling. He then said goodbye and left the shop. After a few days, he finished cataloguing the coins and found he had quickly run out of envelopes and headed back to the old-fashioned shop to purchase some more. However, when he arrived at the shop, he found that the cobblestones had disappeared, and in their place were paving slabs, which he could see had been there for a long period of time. So the old cobblestones could not have been recently replaced. The front of the premises had also changed, as it was no longer quaint and old-fashioned, as it now had a rather drab appearance. As he stepped inside, it was also totally different, and instead of a young woman at the counter, a much older woman served him dressed in modern clothing. He then asked the woman for more envelopes for his coin collection, but she told him she didn't stock them. Now confused, Mr. Squirrel then told the lady that only a week earlier a young lady had sold him some envelopes and went on to describe her appearance, but the older woman told him that no such assistant had worked at the shop, and she herself had worked in this shop for many years. He left the shop dumbfounded. But things became even more bizarre when he took the envelopes to an expert to have them verified and was told that they were around 10 to 15 years old, but did add that the cellulose front of the envelopes had been around since the 1920s. However, judging by the clothing on the young woman, she appeared to be dressed as if she were from the late 19th or early 20th century, which confused him even further. Searching for answers only led to more questions and more confusion. In 1973, Britain had decimal currency. Though the shilling he gave her would have still been legal tender, however, 1 shilling in that period of time would have been worth a lot of money. So why was she not surprised at receiving such a large amount for the envelopes? Mr. Squirrel had somehow entered a shop that appeared to have been dated around 1900, along with the shop assistant, who was also dressed for that period of time. Yet she presented him with relatively modern envelopes and accepted such a large amount of cash, which would have been a modern shilling rather than an old one from 1900, which would have been minted in the Edwardian era. It appears that Mr. Squirrel had entered a time slip, and one theory put forward was that his grandfather was also a coin collector and could have visited the shop in the 1900s, and by some strange incident, their memories had somehow merged. Friends said that he'd probably visited 2 different shops and had simply made a mistake, but Mr. Squirrel was certain that this was not the case. Another theory was that Mr. Squirrel could have entered a parallel universe. The Phantom Cottage. The following was an unusual series of events that took place possibly in the early 20th century, as no exact date was mentioned. The location was in a wood in Haytor, on the eastern edge of Dartmoor in the county of Devon in southwest England. There were several sightings of a phantom cottage that only appeared at certain times, but on other occasions was nowhere to be seen. It had simply vanished. One day a visitor was in the woods and came upon the mysterious cottage, which she admired. She liked it so much that she even approached the owner of the woods to seek further information as to the history of the attractive cottage. However, the visitor was shocked when the owner told the woman that no such cottage existed. Not satisfied with the answer, the woman went back to where she had seen the cottage to prove the man wrong, only to find that it was no longer there, and could find no such building in the area. The visitor was not the only person to encounter this phantom cottage, when another person had recently moved into a house on the other side of the wood, and after a short walk through the woods came upon an attractive cottage. However, when they later returned to the location, they found that it had disappeared. The first visitor and the person who had recently moved into the area had never met each other, yet both described the same quaint building. Later, a surveyor working on the Ordnance Survey came upon the cottage and was surprised that on his previous visits in the area had somehow missed it. He reported that he observed smoke coming from a chimney and there were clothes hanging on the clothesline. When he later returned for a closer inspection, he found no trace of the cottage, and when he flagged a passerby and asked her about the cottage, she too was confused, as she claimed that she had once seen it, but it seemed to have vanished. With so many people reporting their sightings, a closer inspection was later carried out, but they were unable to locate the remains of any cottage, and there were no signs of any foundations of an old cottage. The only explanation given was that the phantom cottage was from the future and not the past, or maybe these people had encountered a time slip or temporarily stepped into a parallel universe.